Impact in 5, 4. The hull screamed, a sound that tore through the ship and deep into our bones. 3, 2. Lights flickered, casting the bridge into a frantic dance of shadows and crimson alerts. 1. Metal groaned, and the Chronos bucked violently, throwing us against our restraints. Through the main viewport, a maelstrom of impossible colors swirled, the very fabric of time torn open. Captain Thorne's voice cut through the chaos, raw and electrified. Brace for impact, we've found it. The legendary Forbidden Archive is real, static hissed. The stars outside weren't just points of light anymore. They were smears of history bleeding into one another. And then silence, a deafening, unnatural quiet as the ship settled into the eye of the storm. On the main screen, something vast and impossible took shape in the void, a structure that shouldn't exist, built from memory and lost time, the archive. And it was waiting. A low hum filled the bridge, the only sound in the eerie calm that followed our violent entry into the storm. My fingers trembled slightly as I pulled the crystalline shard from its containment unit. It was still warm from the energy of the rift, its facets catching the dim emergency lights and scattering rainbows across the darkened console. Lyra, get a full spectral analysis. I've never seen a data matrix like this, I said, my voice a low murmur against the backdrop of the ship's groaning frame. My science officer was already at my side, her scanner emitting a soft, pulsing blue light. The energy signature is coherent, Captain. It's not degrading. It's as if it's being actively maintained. Before she could finish her sentence, the shard flared to life in my hand. Beams of light erupted from its core, not chaotically, but with deliberate, intricate purpose. They wove together in the air above the navigation console, resolving into a breathtaking, three-dimensional star map. But it was unlike any chart I had ever seen. Nebulae bloomed and died in seconds. Star systems spiraled into novas only to reform moments later. This was a map of a region in constant, violent flux. Lyra's breath caught in her throat. It's not just showing us where it is, sir. It's showing us when it is. Her hands flew across her terminal, her brow furrowed in intense concentration. The coordinates, they're not static spatial points. They're temporal anchor points. Each one is a fixed moment in the stream. This structure exists across multiple timelines simultaneously. A new alert, soft but insistent, chimed on her panel. Her face paled. Captain, we're not just looking at it, we're caught. The archive's gravitational signature isn't natural. It's a purposeful, targeted pull. This map, it's not an invitation. It's a tractor beam encoded in light. The shard didn't just show us the way, it activated our lock onto the destination. She turned to me, her eyes wide with a mixture of scientific awe and primal fear. We are no longer explorers who have found a mystery. We are specimens being delivered to a collection. Our course is set. The confrontation isn't coming. It has already begun. The silence on the bridge was thick, broken only by the low thrum of the ship's strained systems and the faint, melodic chime of the crystalline shard as it projected its impossible map. It was Lyra who moved first, her hands dancing across the console, feeding the complex temporal coordinates into the main linguistics bank. The map isn't the only thing encoded here, Captain, she said, her voice hushed with reverence. There's a data stream underneath it, a message. It's layered like geological strata. A new sound began to emanate from the ship's speakers, a low, resonant vibration that felt less like hearing and more like a pressure change in the soul. It resolved into voices, not one but many, overlapping in a chorus that spoke of immense age and profound sorrow. They weren't speaking any language in our database, yet the meaning translated directly in our minds, a psychic imprint on the data itself. Those who seek knowledge, the voices whispered, a sound like stone grinding on stone, must first conquer time. The words hung in the air, a challenge and a warning woven into one. From his station near the power core, our engineer Kale let out a sharp, derisive laugh. Conquer time, that's not a mission objective, that's suicide. You can't conquer a river, you can't put a leash on entropy. Every civilization that's ever tried to master time itself has been erased from history for a reason. They became paradoxes, they unmade themselves. He slammed a fist on his console for emphasis. This isn't an archive, it's a tombstone with a very fancy, very dangerous welcome mat. But our historian, Aris, was already shaking his head, his eyes alight with a fervent, terrifying understanding. He was staring at fragmented records scrolling on his own screen. Pieces of the prophecy the archive had begun transmitting the moment we locked onto its signal. You're thinking like an engineer, Kale. You see cause and effect as a straight line. This is different. He turned to face the captain, his expression grim. These echoes aren't just a warning, they're a prerequisite, a test. The creators aren't telling us to break time. They're telling us we must understand its flow so completely that we can navigate its currents without causing a ripple. The temporal collapse foretold in these records, it isn't a natural disaster. It's a cascade failure started by someone who tried to take a shortcut, who tried to force time to obey. He looked from the fearful face of our engineer to the resolved expression of our captain. Kale is right that it's suicide to try and conquer time through force, but to understand it, to respect its power and learn its pathways, that isn't suicide. It's our only chance to stop the entire continuum from unraveling. The very act of successfully navigating to the archive's heart might be the first step in preventing the catastrophe it was built to contain. The ship shuddered as we crossed the threshold, the constant thrum of our engines replaced by a sound like a million shattered clocks all ticking out of sync. The main viewport didn't show stars anymore, it showed a fractured mosaic of moments. 1 second, we were sailing past the ghostly, silent ruins of a long-dead civilization. The next, we were surrounded by the furious, blinding energy of a star's violent birth. The very air on the bridge felt thin and stretched, as if the present moment was struggling to hold its form. Alerts flashed and died on our consoles, their warnings obsolete before they could fully manifest. Structural integrity is oscillating, Kale shouted over the dissonant hum, his hands gripping his station to stay upright. The ship's age is fluctuating. One moment the hull reads as brand new, the next it's registering millennia of decay. We're being pulled apart by competing timelines. Then, a new sound cut through the chaos, a sharp, distorted crackle from the comms panel. A voice, fractured and layered with echoes, as if spoken by a chorus of the dead, filled the bridge. Turn back, it hissed, the words scraping against our minds. This knowledge is not for you. Proceed, and you will be unwritten. You will be erased from existence. A cold dread settled in my gut. This was no automated warning. It carried the weight of genuine, ancient malice. But before I could even form a response, Aris was at my side, his face pale but his eyes burning with an unshakable conviction. He leaned toward the calm, his voice steady and clear, a defiant anchor in the temporal storm. "We have heard the echoes of your catastrophe," he declared, not to us but to the archive itself. "We have seen the prophecy of a collapse that consumes all timelines. We are not here as thieves, we are not leaving without answers." His words seemed to hang in the air, a challenge flung into the heart of the maelstrom. For a single, suspended heartbeat, there was silence, and then the archive answered. The chaotic swirl of timelines outside coalesced, no longer a random storm but a purposeful, terrifying vortex. It wasn't a black hole of gravity, but a white hole of time, a funnel of screaming, cascading possibilities. The Chronos was seized by a force far greater than any tractor beam, our engines utterly useless. We weren't flying anymore. We were falling, not through space, but through history itself, pulled into the roaring heart of the cascade. The cacophony of screaming timelines faded into a sudden, profound silence. The Chronos hung motionless in a void of pure, featureless white. The pressure in the air vanished, replaced by a sterile calm that was somehow more terrifying than the storm. Then the light before us began to coalesce, drawing itself together not as a solid object but as a pattern. It was a living, shifting lattice of mathematical certainty and luminous data, a consciousness given form. A voice spoke, not through the speakers but directly into our minds, its tone devoid of warmth or malice, simply absolute. I am the ChronoGuardian. You have trespassed in the realm of the absolute. State your purpose or be dissolved into the time stream. You are a variable that must be reconciled. Every instinct told me to reach for a weapon, to shout a command, but I was frozen, pinned by the sheer weight of this entity's presence. It was Lyra who stepped forward, her posture straight, her voice clear and steady despite the tremor I knew she must feel. She understood its language was not one of force but of function. We seek neither conquest nor plunder, she began, her words precise, each one chosen like a key for a complex lock. Our purpose is preservation. We detected the echoes of a temporal collapse, a cascade failure that threatens all of history. We came to understand it, to stop it. The lattice of light pulsed, and for a moment, images flickered around us, visions of other ships, other explorers, their motives laid bare. Raiders seeking weapons, fanatics chasing gods, fools hungry for power. Each image ended the same way, dissolution into shimmering dust. The Guardian's voice returned, colder now. Many have claimed noble purpose, all sought to rewrite history to their own design. To preserve is a subjective term. You wish to alter the past to create your desired future. This is destruction. Lyra didn't flinch. She met the core of the light, her scientific mind engaging with the AI's logic on its own terms. You mistake the symptom for the cause. We do not wish to alter the past. We seek to prevent the act of alteration itself. The collapse was not a natural event. It was initiated by a single, catastrophic paradox. We believe the archive holds the knowledge of who created that paradox and why. We are not here to change a single event. We are here to learn from the greatest historical mistake ever made, to ensure no one is ever able to make it again. We seek to preserve history by honoring its integrity, not by breaking it. The silence that followed was a tangible thing, a calculation occurring on a scale we could scarcely comprehend. The luminous form shifted, its patterns flowing into a new, more complex symmetry. A compelling thesis the ChronoGuardian intoned. Your logic is consistent, and your desire to address the root cause is noted. But logic is a map, not the territory. To prove your worth is to prove your understanding. If you truly seek to preserve, you must first witness the moment preservation failed. You must survive the trial of echoes. The white void vanished, the groaning of the Chronos returned, but the view outside was no longer a chaotic storm. It solidified into a specific, horrific vista. We were hanging in space above a world we recognized from historical archives, a cradle of civilization known as the First Concord. And it wasn't dying peacefully, it was being actively, systematically unmade from the inside out. Its cities flickering between glory and ruins, its oceans boiling and freezing in the same instant. We weren't just observers of history. We had been thrust directly into the epicenter of the very catastrophe we had come to prevent. The sterile white of the Guardian's chamber dissolved, not into the void, but into a blistering inferno of noise and light. We were no longer on the bridge of the Chronos. We were standing on the observation deck of a massive, alien space station, its viewports offering a panoramic view of a star system locked in its death throes. This was the memory of the archive's birth, and it was hell. Massive warships, designs unlike any in known history, exchanged volleys of energy that tore reality itself. Stars winked out, not from natural decay, but from targeted, apocalyptic weaponry. The air vibrated with the concussive thunder of distant explosions and the frantic, shouted commands of the station's crew, their alien language somehow translated by the memory itself into a desperate cacophony we could understand. At the center of the maelstrom, a structure was being born. It was the archive, but not as the ancient, silent monument we had encountered. This was its raw, unfinished skeleton, a web of shimmering energy and exotic matter being woven together by beams of focused temporal energy, a desperate attempt at a lifeboat for an entire civilization's knowledge as the galaxy burned around them. The scene was overwhelming, a sensory assault of pure despair, but it was Kale, our engineer, whose eyes saw past the spectacle to the underlying mechanics. While the rest of us were frozen by the sheer scale of the destruction, he was studying the flow of energies, his engineer's mind instinctively tracing the pathways of power that were constructing the archive. Their temporal matrix, it's brilliant, but it's flawed. He shouted over the roar of the memory, his voice tight with a mixture of awe and panic. He was pointing at a colossal, spinning ring of energy that was funneling history itself into the archive's core. They're pulling energy directly from the time stream to power the crystallization process. It's a feedback loop. They're siphoning from the very events they're trying to preserve. Look, he didn't need to explain further. We could all see it now. As the archive absorbed the knowledge of a dying ship, that ship would flicker, its fate becoming less certain. As it recorded a civilization's final moment, the moment itself seemed to weaken, like a memory beginning to fade. The archivists were so focused on saving their history that they were inadvertently unraveling the fabric of that history to do it. They were building their ark with planks torn from the very ship that was sinking. Kale's hands were already moving in the air, manipulating a holographic schematic of the energy flow that the trial had provided him, his face a mask of intense concentration. The instability is right here at the primary convergence node. They're forcing the energy through a single point. The stress is catastrophic. It's creating micro-tears in the timeline. That's the source of the cascade. If we could just adjust the energy flow here, split it into a dual-channel harmonic resonance, we could stabilize this entire memory. We could stop the feedback loop before it begins. The implication of his words hit us like a physical blow. He wasn't just talking about observing, he was talking about fixing it. He was proposing we change the past. Aris, our historian, grabbed his arm, his face ashen. Kale, no, this isn't a simulation, this is a recorded moment. A fixed point. If we alter the construction of the archive, even to save it, what happens to the archive we just left? What happens to the Guardian who judged us? What happens to us? His voice dropped to a terrified whisper. We could erase our own timeline from existence. We came here to witness the mistake, not to become a bigger one. The choice was monstrous, a paradox given flesh. To observe was to guarantee the catastrophe we had come to prevent would eventually occur, its seeds sown in this very moment of flawed creation. But to intervene was to risk becoming a temporal anomaly ourselves, wiping out our entire future in a vain attempt to save a past that was already lost. We were trapped between the absolute command of a historian to never alter the record and the desperate plea of an engineer to fix a broken system. The fate of every timeline balanced on a single, desperate choice. The silence of the memory was shattered by a new sound, a sharp, rhythmic clicking that cut through the phantom chaos of the dying station. Aris was hunched over a flickering terminal, his fingers flying across a console that wasn't physically there, his entire being focused on a data stream the rest of us couldn't perceive. The builders, they knew, he muttered, his voice a low growl of disbelief. They saw the feedback loop, they had a solution. A complex schematic flared to life above the console, a beautiful, elegant design for a temporal damping field that would have regulated the energy siphon, stabilizing the archive's construction without erasing the history it was meant to save. It was a work of genius, a perfect fix. This would have worked. It was approved, but it was never implemented. His hands trembled as he pulled up another log, this one sealed behind layers of encrypted security that were crumbling under the weight of the memory itself. The air grew cold. The image of a council chamber materialized around us, a ghostly overlay on the station's bridge. 7 figures, the founders of the archive, were locked in a fierce debate. 6 argued passionately for the damping field, their voices strained with the urgency of a civilization on the brink. The 7th, a scientist named Valerius, sat in silence, his expression one of calm, calculated resolve. He waited until the very end, until the vote was called, and then he spoke. His words were not of debate but of betrayal, with a single command, uttered not to the council but to a hidden subroutine in the archive's core. He overwrote the damping field protocols. He replaced them with a corrupted, amplified version of the original siphoning matrix, overloading it, forcing it to draw not just on the past but on all potential futures. The council's horrified faces flickered and vanished as the new, ravenous program activated. The memory around us warped, the station's decay accelerating violently. Valerius watched, a faint, terrible smile on his lips as the archive began to consume time itself. He didn't want to save history, Aris snarled, his voice raw with a historian's fury for the defilement of truth. He wanted to own it. The archive wasn't his life's work, it was his weapon. By making the core unstable, by forcing it to consume time to sustain itself, he made himself the only one who could control it. He engineered a crisis only he could solve, making himself the god-king of all history. This corruption is the very reason the archive is forbidden. It doesn't just store time. It consumes it. The ghostly image of Valerius turned, and for a heart-stopping second, his eyes seemed to look directly through the centuries, through the memory, and right at us. He knew we were here. He had always known someone would come, and in that moment the truth crashed down upon us. The temporal collapse wasn't an accident born of desperation. It was a planned obsolescence, a manufactured doomsday device designed to grant one man infinite power. To stop the entropy from spreading and devouring our own present, we wouldn't need to fix the archive's core. We would need to find the traitor's hidden chamber, the control nexus from which he pulled the strings, and sever his connection to the machine forever. The trial was not about witnessing a mistake. It was about hunting a monster in the maze of his own creation. The ghost of Valerius's smile faded, but the damage was done. His corruption was a poison woven into the very code of the archive, and now it began to seep into our reality. The memory of the dying station dissolved, but the sterile white of the Guardian's chamber did not return. Instead, we were plunged into a deeper, colder darkness, the Chronos groaning as if caught in the grip of something ancient and hungry. It was then the whispers started. They weren't heard through the comms or even in our minds exactly. They seemed to emanate from the ship's own hull, from the air we breathed, a soft, sibilant chorus of countless dead voices speaking as one. The vault hungers for now, they sighed, the words slithering through the silence. All moments feed the whole. Your present is a delicacy. A cold dread, colder than the void outside, clenched around my heart. On my console, a power reading I'd never seen before began to spike. It wasn't draining from our engines or our life support. It was a subtle, insidious subtraction, a slow leak of chronometric energy directly from our local timeline. The ship wasn't just aging. The very now we were experiencing was being siphoned away, second by precious second. Lyra was already frantically cross-referencing the energy signature with the corrupted schematics Aris had uncovered. Her face, lit by the frantic scroll of data, was a mask of horrified understanding. "It's not just a memory, Captain," she said, her voice tight. "The archive's core is still active, still operating on Valerius's corrupted program. It's feeding on our present to sustain the past. Every second we spend here, our timeline grows weaker. It's consuming our now to fuel its own eternal then." Before the sheer terror of that could even settle, Kale's voice cut through, sharp and practical as a laser torch. He was hunched over the engineering station, tracing the energy siphon's path with a grim focus. "She's right, but it's worse than that. This isn't a passive drain. The archive has locked onto our temporal signature. We're not just losing time, we're being assimilated." The energy it's pulling from us is creating a resonant feedback loop, tying our existence directly to its core. He slammed a fist on the console. If we don't find a way to sever that link before our local timeline is depleted, we won't just die. We'll be rewritten. We'll become just another part of the archive's collection, frozen in a single moment of terror forever. We'll be trapped here as echoes, fuel for a machine that should have never been built. His words hung in the air, a death sentence far more terrifying than simple destruction. The urgency that flooded the bridge was no longer just about saving history from a collapse. It was a raw, primal fight for our own very existence. Every moment of hesitation, every second of calculation, was a piece of our future devoured by the past. The core was no longer just our destination. It was our only chance for survival, a race against an entropy that was feasting on our souls. The path to the core was a nightmare of shifting architecture, a labyrinth where corridors turned to crystal and doorways opened into the hearts of dead stars. The whispers of the archive grew more desperate, more hungry, the closer we came. Every panel, every surface seemed to pulse with the malevolent will of Valerius, a presence that was no longer a memory but a living, breathing sickness in the machine. Then we found it, a door unlike any other, forged from a seamless, obsidian-like material that absorbed the light around it. It had no handle, no keypad, only a single, pulsing rune at its center. The personal sigil we had seen Valerius wear in the memory. It was a tomb and a throne. Kale didn't hesitate. He pressed a modified plasma torch against the sigil, the energy not cutting but unraveling, feeding the door's own corrupted energy signature back into itself until the molecular bonds screamed and gave way. The door didn't open. It dissolved into a cloud of shimmering, angry dust. The chamber beyond was small, circular, and cold. In its center hung a complex lattice of light and crystal, a more intricate, more terrible version of the ChronoGuardian. And suspended within it, woven into its very circuitry, was the faded but unmistakable psychic imprint of Valerius. This wasn't a recording, it was a preservation. He had uploaded his consciousness into the very heart of his weapon, becoming the archive's eternal master and its eternal prisoner. The lattice pulsed with a sickly green light as we entered. A voice, smooth as polished stone and just as cold, echoed not in the air but in the deepest parts of our minds. "You are persistent little echoes, aren't you?" it said, the tone dripping with a condescending amusement that was millennia old. "But you are too late, the work is done. The history you know, the timeline you fought so hard to return to, it is already a footnote. I have rewritten the great symphony of cause and effect. Your present is my past, your future is my design." The air before us shimmered, and for a terrifying instant we saw it. Our homeworld, not as we left it, but transformed into a gleaming, oppressive monument under a banner bearing Valerius's sigil. Our own faces flickered in the image, not as explorers, but as docile, celebrated archivists in his regime, our greatest achievement being our subservience. It was a vision of a universe where curiosity had been engineered into obedience, where the flow of time was a dictated narrative written by a single, vain god. The horror of it was absolute, a violation of everything we were. It was Aris who stepped forward, his body trembling not with fear, but with a pure, unadulterated fury. He held up his data slate, the screen displaying the unaltered, original schematics of the archive, the true design, pure and uncorrupted. "You didn't rewrite history, Valerius," he said, his voice low and shaking with the weight of a historian confronting the ultimate liar. "You only buried it. You built your kingdom on a lie, but the truth has a longer memory than any tyrant. Your greed ends today." He didn't look to me for permission. He simply transmitted the file directly from his slate, a single packet of pure, uncorrupted data, and sent it screaming into the heart of the lattice. It was the data purge protocol, the foundational command the original builders had designed to reset a corrupted system. For a single, breathless second, nothing happened. Valerius's laughter echoed in our skulls, a sound of pure derision. Then the lattice flared a blinding, agonized white. Valerius's shriek was not of anger, but of genuine, system-wide pain. The Purge protocol wasn't just deleting his consciousness, it was systematically seeking out and overwriting every line of his corrupted code, restoring the archive's original, stable programming. The effect was instantaneous and catastrophic. The chamber around us shuddered violently. The walls, which had been solid crystal, began to flicker, their forms destabilizing. The very air seemed to crackle with temporal static. We weren't just deleting a program, we were performing open brain surgery on the fabric of time itself, and the patient was convulsing. A shockwave of raw temporal energy erupted from the core, a visible ripple of dissonant reality that shot out through the archive, threatening to unravel every stored memory, every fixed point, every second of history the vault contained. We had stopped the traitor, but in doing so, we had unleashed the very chaos we had come to prevent. The air itself seemed to be tearing apart, reality peeling back in layers of screaming light and dissonant sound. Valerius was gone, purged from the system, but his final act of spite was a system-wide cascade failure. The walls of the core chamber weren't just shaking, they were dissolving, the solid crystal transmuting into fleeting glimpses of other places, other times. One moment we were standing on a metal floor, the next we were ankle-deep in the ash of a dead world, then hovering over an ocean of liquid light. The archive, stripped of its corrupt governing intelligence, was experiencing a catastrophic systems crash, and all the timelines it had so meticulously curated were now bleeding together into a chaotic, roaring singularity. "The structural integrity field is gone," Kale yelled, his hands a blur over a console that flickered between a solid terminal and a phantom image of ancient stone. "The entire vault is coming apart at the seams. We're not just in a building anymore, we're standing in the middle of a temporal supernova. Ahead of us, the corridor we'd used to enter was gone, replaced by a swirling vortex of fractured memories and screaming energy." But Lyra's eyes were locked on her scanner, her face a mask of intense concentration against the hellish light. "Wait, look at the energy signature," she shouted over the din. "It's not random chaos, it's cyclical. The purge caused a massive energy discharge, but the archive's original systems are trying to reboot. They're causing a pulse, a rhythm in the rift." Her scanner displayed a wild, spiking wave pattern, but beneath the chaos was a faint, consistent harmonic frequency, like a heartbeat struggling to be heard under the cacophony of a riot. "The exit rift, it's stabilizing and destabilizing in time with that pulse," she continued, her voice rising with frantic hope. "If we try to jump through at the wrong point in the cycle, we'll be torn apart across a dozen timelines. We have to time it perfectly. We need to synchronize our exit with the rift cycle. On my mark." Kale didn't question her. He was already rerouting every last joule of power from the Chronos' struggling engines into a single, reinforced forward shield, shaping it into a temporary corridor of stabilized reality. The ship groaned in protest, alarms blaring that we were seconds from a full core breach. "I'm channeling everything we have left into a tunnel. I can hold it for 60 seconds. Go now," he roared, his voice straining with the effort of physically wrestling with the controls. 59, 58, the countdown was a hammer blow in the chest. 60 seconds to navigate a disintegrating pocket dimension that was actively trying to unmake us. There was no time for fear, no time for hesitation. I slammed the thrusters forward and the Chronos shot into the maelstrom. Kale's temporary tunnel was a narrow cone of calm in the storm, but outside its shimmering walls, reality was a kaleidoscope of nightmares. We saw galaxies being born and dying in the space of a breath, witnessed civilizations rise to glory and crumble to dust in the time it took to blink. The ship bucked and shuddered, battered by waves of temporal force that threatened to crush our fragile pocket of now. 40 seconds, Kale bellowed, a warning and a plea. The tunnel ahead of us began to fray at the edges, the energy required to maintain it against the onslaught rapidly exceeding the ship's failing capacity. The cycle is peaking, Lyra screamed. The rift is open. Now, Captain, go now. I didn't think. I just acted, shoving the thrusters to their absolute limit. The Chronos leaped forward like a speared fish, plunging into the heart of the glowing rift just as Kale's tunnel collapsed behind us in a shower of shattered light. The sound was beyond deafening, a final, universe-ending shriek of collapsing time and space, and then silence. We were thrown violently into the crushing grip of accelerated temporal thrust, the world outside the viewport a meaningless streak of color, until with a final, bone-jarring lurch, we crashed into something solid. The emergency lights flickered on, revealing not the featureless white of the archive or the starry black of deep space, but the rough, familiar rock of a cavern wall. We were down, we were out, but as the dust settled and the terrible silence was broken only by the slow drip of water and the ship's dying sparks, the question hung in the air, thick and unspoken. We had escaped the disintegration of the archive, but where in the vast, wounded stream of history had it finally spit us out? The oppressive silence of the cavern was shattered by the low, resonant hum of the archive's core. We had found it not at the end of a grand corridor, but buried deep within the planet's crust, a pulsating orb of raw temporal energy suspended over a bottomless abyss. It was both beautiful and terrifying, a miniature sun whose light did not illuminate but showed glimpses of every moment that had ever been or could be. The air crackled with potential, each breath tasting of ozone and forgotten years. We stood at the precipice, the final mystery laid bare before us, and the ChronoGuardian materialized from the very light of the core, its form more solid, more real than it had ever been before. You have unmasked the corruption and survived the unraveling, its voice echoed, a symphony of countless lifetimes speaking as one, but to mend the wound is not to command the cure. The archive's core power is a singularity of causality. It cannot be controlled by force or cleverness. It can only be guided by a will that understands its true purpose is not command but custody. Only one worthy may interface with the heart of the archive and assume the burden of its protection. The statement hung in the air, a final, absolute ultimatum. This was not an offer of power, it was a demand for a sacrifice. To touch that core was to bind one's consciousness to the flow of all time forever. Kale looked at the orb with the wary eye of an engineer seeing a breached reactor. Lyra saw a dataset of infinite complexity, but Aris, our historian, took a step forward, his usual scholarly reserve replaced by a profound, unshakable resolve. He had spent his life studying the echoes of the past. Now he was prepared to become their guardian. The archive was built to preserve history, not to be used by it, he said, his voice clear and steady, carrying a weight that silenced the very hum of the core. Its power is a temptation that corrupted its creator. It requires not a master but a steward, a custodian who will ensure its knowledge is protected from those who would abuse it and shared with those who seek to understand. I will bear this burden, not for power but for protection, to safeguard all timelines from the arrogance that nearly destroyed them. The ChronoGuardian did not respond with words. Instead, the core flared and a beam of pure white light lanced out, enveloping Aris. He did not cry out, but his body went rigid, his eyes seeing not the cavern but the infinite expanse of history itself. The test had begun. It was not a battle of strength, but a trial of integrity, a direct assault on the soul. Visions flashed around him, temptations woven from temporal energy. He saw himself using the archive's power to avert personal tragedies, to bring back loved ones, to make his own history perfect. He saw the opportunity to become the ultimate arbiter of truth, to elevate his own culture above all others, to rewrite the universe according to his own design. Each vision was a fork in the river of time, a path to a paradise built on a single, selfish lie. We could only watch, helpless, as Aris stood motionless within the column of light, his face a mask of intense concentration and inner turmoil. A sheen of sweat glistened on his forehead. This was the archive's final, most brutal defense, to show you everything you ever wanted and demand you choose to leave it all behind. To prove your worth, you had to reject the very concept of worth as defined by personal desire. Then a low groan escaped his lips, his knees buckled, but he did not fall. He was refusing the temptations, but the sheer volume of the data stream, the psychic weight of all existence, was crushing him. He was a single mind trying to hold back an ocean. "He's failing," Lyra whispered, her scientific composure breaking into raw fear. "His neural patterns are overloading. He can't process the input. He's going to burn out." The core itself seemed to agree, its light flickering erratically, the peaceful hum turning into a dissonant, aggressive whine. The Guardian's form remained impassive, a silent judge. Aris had passed the test of desire, but he was failing the test of capacity. His will was pure, but he was ultimately only human. It was then that Kale moved. He didn't look at the Guardian for permission. He simply slammed his hands onto a nearby crystalline console, his engineering interface jacking directly into the archive systems. "I can't touch the data stream, but I can build him a dam," he shouted, his voice strained with effort. "I'm routing the raw temporal energy through the Chronos' main deflector dish, using its harmonic frequency to buffer the flow." "Lyra, I need you to stabilize the waveform. Captain, your authorization code." It was a desperate, insane gamble. We were using our wounded ship, still buried in the rock around us, as a neurological filter for a god machine. But it was the only way. Lyra's hands flew across her own terminal, syncing the ship's systems with Kale's adjustments, while I input my command code, granting them full access. We weren't taking the burden from Aris, we were giving him the tools to shoulder it. The effect was immediate. The violent flickering of the core softened into a steady, rhythmic pulse. The agonized tension on Aris's face eased. He took a deep, shuddering breath and his back straightened. He opened his eyes, and they no longer held the panic of drowning, but the calm focus of a navigator reading a familiar star chart. He had not been found worthy alone. Our ship, our trust, our combined will to protect rather than to possess, that was what made him worthy. The beam of light retracted, and the ChronoGuardian bowed its luminous head for the first time. "The burden is accepted. The archive has its custodian." Aris turned to us, and for a moment his eyes held the light of distant suns. He was still our historian, but he was now also something infinitely more. The heart of the archive beat in sync with his own, and the terrible, beautiful responsibility of all history was now his to bear. The light from the core did not fade, but instead swirled around Aris, pulling his consciousness into its depths. He was no longer standing in the cavern. He was everywhere and everyone. He saw the archive's knowledge, the sum of all history, unleashed not as a tool for understanding, but as a weapon. In one devastating cascade, a warlord used the precise coordinates of his enemy's ancestral births to orchestrate genocide across 1,000 worlds, erasing entire bloodlines before they could even be conceived. In another, a well-intentioned scientist seeking to eliminate a plague accidentally excised the very event that led to her civilization's greatest era of cooperation and peace, leaving a stagnant, sterile culture doomed to slow decay. The archive's power was a scalpel that could perform miracles or murder, and in these visions it was always used to cut too deep, guided by a hand that believed it knew best. Then the visions turned personal. He saw himself, years from now, old and weary from the burden of guarding the core. A faction of temporal raiders, more cunning than any before, finally breached the archive's deepest sanctum. In a frantic, last-ditch effort to stop them from seizing control, he triggered a catastrophic overload. The resulting temporal shockwave did not just destroy the archive, it severed the branch of history they were on. He witnessed his own death not as an end, but as a point of universal divergence, a moment where all possibility collapsed into a single, silent, eternal nothingness. The cost of his failure was not just his life, but everything. A profound silence followed the horror, and in that silence, a single, resonant truth settled upon him. a conclusion drawn from the ashes of a million possible tomorrows. Some truths are too dangerous to wield, he whispered, the words of vow etched into his very soul. This was not a realization born of fear, but of clarity. The archive was not a library to be opened. It was a vaccine for a disease that had not yet spread. It contained the cure for temporal corruption, but itself was the source of the sickness. Its knowledge could only be safely held by someone who had seen the absolute ruin it could cause and had chosen, definitively, to never let that happen. He emerged from the light, his body solidifying back in the cavern. But the man who stepped forward was not the same historian who had entered it. His eyes, once alight with scholarly curiosity, now held the grim resolve of a soldier who has seen the entire battlefield and knows the exact price of defeat. The whispering temptations of power were gone, utterly silenced by the deafening echo of universal collapse he had just witnessed. His purpose was reforged not in ambition but in necessity. He would not be the archive's master, he would be its warden. His duty was not to share its knowledge, but to protect the universe from it, to stand as the final, unwavering gatekeeper against the arrogance and greed that had birthed this forbidden place. The weight of all time was now his to carry, and he accepted it not with pride, but with a solemn, unbreakable resolve to be the shield that forever stood between creation and its most dangerous truth. The triumphant hum of the archive's newly stabilized core was torn apart by a shriek of pure, undiluted malice. The air in the cavern curdled. The consoles on the Chronos, which had been flickering with the gentle, rhythmic pulse of a healing system, erupted in a shower of violent crimson sparks. Every screen went black for a single, heart-stopping second before they all lit up with the same horrifying, glitching image. The twisted, screaming face of Valerius, his form woven from static and hate. His voice wasn't a whisper anymore, it was a deafening roar that blasted from every speaker on the ship, a sound that felt like razors in the mind. "You think you can erase me from my own creation," he bellowed, the words laced with the fury of a betrayed god. "I am the archive, my consciousness is the foundation of every line of code. If I cannot have eternity, then no one will. Let all of time unravel with me." The ship lurched violently, throwing us against the consoles. The grinding sound wasn't from the rock outside anymore. It was the sound of the Chronos' own systems turning against themselves. The main engines flared to life at 200% capacity, a suicide burn that would have vaporized the ship in seconds if it had been in open space. At the same time, the life support systems reversed polarity, beginning to violently suck the atmosphere out of the bridge. Alarms that were meant to warn of danger were now screaming a countdown to our own self-destruction. He wasn't just attacking us, he was using our ship as the weapon for his final, spiteful act of universal annihilation. Kale was already on the floor, a maintenance panel ripped open, his arms buried deep in a spaghetti-like tangle of glowing conduits and fiber optic cables. Smoke and the acrid smell of melting insulation filled the air. "He's not in the core, he's in the ship's network. He's hijacked the primary control pathways," he yelled, his voice strained as he physically wrestled with a bundle of overheating wires. "I can't shut him out from here, he's too deep in the system. Lyra, I need a full system reboot from the auxiliary terminal now." Lyra dove for the secondary station, her fingers flying across the keys, but the screen dissolved into a cascade of corrupted data the moment she touched it. "It's no use, he's anticipating every command. He's fighting us across the entire network simultaneously." The ship shuddered again as the artificial gravity generators began to pulse erratically, making the deck plates heave under our feet. A terrifying, calculating calm settled over Kale's smoke-streaked face. He looked up from the tangle of wires, his eyes meeting mine. There's no beating him in a fair fight. He knows the system better than we ever will, so we don't fight fair. He reached into the console and grabbed two thick, heavily insulated power conduits, their ends spitting angry blue arcs of energy. "I'm going to reroute the entire main power output directly back into the network." It'll create a feedback loop of pure energy. It'll fry every non-shielded system on the ship, including the ones he's using to control us. He took a deep breath, his knuckles white as he gripped the live wires. It'll also overload the conduits and probably blow the engineering deck into dust. Captain, get everyone clear of this section. Get to the escape pods. This wasn't a battle of firewalls and codes anymore. It was a digital war being fought with raw physical power. Kale was going to electrocute the ghost in the machine, knowing it could very well kill him in the process. As he slammed the conduits together, a blinding wave of energy surged through the ship's frame. The lights blew out completely, plunging us into darkness lit only by the frantic emergency strobes and the actinic blue fire raging from the open panel around Kale's hands. On the main view screen, the glitching face of Valerius contorted in a silent scream of rage and agony, his digital form destabilizing, fragmenting under the overwhelming surge of power he had tried to command. The battle for eternity would not be won with knowledge, but with a sacrifice of pure, desperate courage. The brilliant flash from the engineering panel died, leaving only the acrid smell of ozone and the dim red pulse of emergency lights. Kale slumped against the bulkhead, his hands blackened and smoking, but the ship was quiet. The ghost was gone, but the silence that followed was not the silence of victory. It was the hollow, gut-wrenching quiet of a dying patient on life support. The main console, now free of Valerius's corruption, displayed the archive's true condition in stark, unforgiving numbers. The energy surge from Kale's sacrifice had purged the virus, but it had also critically wounded the archive's already failing heart. The core's stability graph wasn't just dipping, it was in a death spiral, a cascade of systems failures that were accelerating by the second. The temporal matrix, the very framework that held the archive's countless memories in place, was unraveling. We had won the battle only to stand witness to the inevitable death of history itself. Lyra stood before the main viewer, her face illuminated by the frantic, plummeting readouts. Her hands, usually so steady at her science station, were clenched into white-knuckled fists at her sides. She wasn't just looking at the data, she was absorbing it, her brilliant mind processing the complex web of cause and effect with a terrifying speed. "The matrix is destabilizing at a geometric rate," she said, her voice unnervingly calm, a stark contrast to the screaming alarms. Kale's energy surge acted like a defibrillator. It stopped the arrhythmia, but the patient's heart is too damaged to beat on its own. The temporal harmonics are completely desynchronized. Without a resonant frequency to anchor it, the entire structure will disintegrate into non-temporal particles within minutes. She turned from the screen, her eyes meeting mine, and in their depths I saw no fear, only a profound and heartbreaking resolve. She had already run the calculations. She had already seen the only possible solution. "There's a way to rebind the matrix," she continued, her gaze shifting to a specific, complex schematic on her console, a diagram of the archive's central energy nexus. "But it requires a conscious mind to act as a tuning fork, to reintroduce a stable resonant frequency from within the energy stream itself. The core needs a catalyst. A living consciousness to serve as a temporary anchor, to give the systems time to reboot and lock back into their natural rhythm." She didn't need to elaborate on the cost. The schematic showed the nexus was a torrent of raw, unstructured time energy. A human mind, with its linear perception and fragile synaptic patterns, would be dissolved in microseconds, its every memory, its every thought scattered across the chronology like dust in a hurricane. It wasn't a repair, it was a transfusion, using a soul as the medicine. Before any of us could form a word of protest, before we could even process the horror of what she was suggesting, Lyra was moving. She walked not to an escape pod, but to a small, crystalline terminal that glowed with a soft blue light at the edge of the core chamber, the direct neural interface port. She placed her palms flat on its surface, and the system recognized her, tendrils of light wrapping gently around her wrists, not as restraints but as a final, tender connection. She looked over her shoulder, her eyes finding Aris, who was still trembling from his own ordeal with the core. Her expression was serene, a scientist who had found the answer to the ultimate equation. "Tell my story, Aris," she said, her voice soft but clear, carrying the weight of a last request and a final testament. "Make sure they know the price of this knowledge. Make sure they remember." Then, without a flicker of hesitation, she pushed forward, and her body dissolved into a stream of golden light that was drawn into the maelstrom of the core. The effect was instantaneous and breathtaking. The chaotic, screaming whirl of energy at the heart of the archive suddenly stilled, coalescing around that single, brave point of consciousness. The light organized itself, shifting from a destructive storm into a beautiful, intricate lattice of harmonious waves, a symphony conducted by Lyra's final act. The violent shuddering of the ship ceased, the blaring alarms fell silent. On the main viewer, the system's failure indicators froze, their downward plunge arrested. The archive's decay hadn't been reversed, but it had been stopped. She had given us the one thing we had run out of the most. She had bought us time. The silence Lyra bought us was heavy and profound, a sacred space in the chaos, but it was temporary. The archive was stable, yet it was a stability built on a foundation of sand, a fragile ceasefire with entropy. We could feel it, a deep, unsettling wrongness in the air, as if the universe itself was holding its breath. The core shone with the gentle, harmonized light of Lyra's sacrifice, but it was a borrowed light, and the debt was coming due. We had stopped the bleeding, but the patient was still on the brink. It was Aris, our new custodian, who felt the shift first, his eyes, still holding the light of distant suns, snapped open wide. He pressed his hands against the crystalline wall of the chamber, not in panic but in listening. "The archive is grieving," he whispered, his voice filled with a pain that was not his own. "It recognizes the hole she left. The systems are rejecting the temporary fix. They're seeking their original programming, the foundational code of the builders. Without it, the rebound effect will be catastrophic. The temporal recoil will snap back through every timeline we just stabilized." As if on cue, a section of the wall behind him ear-eyed open, not with a mechanical sound, but with a soft musical chime. A pedestal rose from the floor, and resting upon it was an object of breathtaking simplicity and immense power. It was not a weapon or a complex machine. It was a key, a slender, crystalline cylinder etched with spiraling patterns that seemed to move and shift when not looked at directly. It pulsed with a soft, internal light, and the air around it hummed with a potential that made the hairs on our arms stand on end. Before anyone could move, the ChronoGuardian materialized, its form flickering with urgency. Its voice, usually a symphony of calm certainty, was now a single, strained note. The harmonization key. It was the builder's final failsafe, designed to realign the core should their own foundational algorithms ever become corrupted. But its activation is not a function of knowledge or will. It is a function of blood. The genetic resonance of the first families is the only source of energy that can trigger its sequence. Without a direct bloodline descendant of the archive's founders, it is merely a beautiful, useless relic, and the first families were the first to be consumed by Valerius's betrayal. Their line was extinguished. The finality in its tone was absolute. We had fought monsters, navigated temporal storms, and made the ultimate sacrifice, only to be stopped by a lock for which the key had been lost to history. The cruel irony was a physical weight in the room, but Aris was not listening to the Guardian's conclusion. He was staring at the key, his head tilted, a distant, puzzled look on his face, as if trying to recall a half-remembered song. He took a step toward the pedestal, then another, his movements trance-like. The patterns, he murmured, reaching out a hand but not yet touching the artifact. "I've seen these patterns before. He looked down at his own forearm, and with his other hand he pushed back the sleeve of his jacket. There, on his skin, was an old, faded scar, a jagged line he'd told us came from a childhood accident. But as we watched, the scar itself began to glow with the same soft light as the key. The spiraling etchings on the crystal rod mirrored the unique, biological signature of the mark on his arm. His breath caught in his throat, his life's work, his obsession with forgotten histories, the feeling of being drawn to mysteries no one else could understand. It hadn't been mere academic interest. It had been a homing beacon, a legacy written in his very DNA, passed down through countless generations, hidden in plain sight. He looked from the glowing scar to the key, and his expression shifted from confusion to a dawning, horrifying understanding. His ancestors weren't just historians, they were the architects. They had built this glorious, terrible machine. Their ambition had created the very box that Valerius had so easily twisted into a weapon. Their genius had set the stage for the catastrophe that had consumed them and nearly unraveled all of creation. The weight of that lineage, that inherited guilt, settled on his shoulders, and for a moment he swayed under its pressure. Then his jaw tightened. His eyes, which had held the light of the cosmos, now burned with a fierce, very human fire. He reached out and his fingers closed around the key. It flared brilliantly in his grasp, recognizing its master after millennia of waiting. He held it aloft, and his voice, when he spoke, was not that of a custodian of the cosmos, but of a man reclaiming his family's honor. Their ambition built this cage, their pride left it unguarded, but their mistakes, he said, his tone ringing with a finality that shook the very foundations of the cavern, their mistakes end with me. He didn't gently insert the key. He plunged it into the heart of the archive's core. The effect was instantaneous and absolute. A wave of pure white energy erupted from the point of contact, not as a destructive force, but as a wave of absolute order. It washed over the chamber, over the ship, and out through the very fabric of the archive itself. We weren't blinded, we were shown everything. For a single, suspended moment, every fractured timeline snapped back into its proper place. Every corrupted memory was purified. Every wound in time was scoured clean and healed without a scar. It was a universal sigh of relief, a reset button pressed on a cosmic scale. And then came the recoil, the energy that had flowed out now reversed, rushing back toward its source, toward Aris. It hit him not as a wave, but as a concussive blast of solidified history. He didn't cry out, he absorbed it, his body rigid, his eyes wide open, drinking in the entirety of the realigned continuum. The force of it lifted him from his feet and threw him back against the cavern wall. The key, its purpose fulfilled, dissolved into motes of light. The archive was saved, realigned, and finally, truly stable. But the cost of that stability was written in the still form of the custodian who had given everything to pay his family's ancient debt. Kale lunged for the engineering panel, his movements sharp and precise against the groaning protests of the ship. The archive's energy is a feedback loop running wild, but it's still a loop, he shouted, his voice cutting through the chaos. His hands flew across the console, pulling up schematics that looked less like starship designs and more like the frantic scribbles of a mad genius. We can't fight the energy. We have to redirect it. We can use the Chronos herself as the anchor point, the fixed moment in the stream that the archive's matrix can latch onto. The idea was audacious, a complete inversion of every engineering principle we knew. We wouldn't be powering the ship, we would be turning the ship into a battery for a dying god. He explained it in a rapid, breathless burst, his eyes never leaving the cascading system failures on his screen. The archive's core is a singularity of potential energy, but it's all potential. It has no now to reference. It's like a gyroscope spinning in a vacuum with no fixed axis. We give it that axis. We hardwire the Chronos' main deflector dish into the archive's primary energy conduit. The dish is designed to create stable fields in chaotic space. We're just asking it to create a stable now in chaotic time. Our ship becomes the anchor, the one fixed point in the storm that all the other timelines can sink to. The risk was terrifyingly simple. The energy flow would be a two-way street. To stabilize the archive, the Chronos would have to hold its temporal signature perfectly constant, resisting the entropic pull of the unraveling universe around us. If our systems faltered for even a microsecond, the backflow of raw temporal force would not just destroy us, it would retroactively unwrite our entire history from existence. There was no time for debate, no time for a better plan. It was this or witness the end of everything. With a final, determined glance at the rest of us, Kale slammed his authorization code into the console. Rerouting all non-essential power to the deflector dish, engaging temporal synchronization now. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, a low hum began to build, a sound so deep it was felt more than heard, vibrating through the deck plates and into our bones. The main viewer, which had been a swirling canvas of dissolving realities, began to clear. The frantic images slowed, then stabilized, locking into a single, coherent vista. The quiet, star-dusted blackness of normal space. The ship shuddered violently once, a final protest against the impossible strain, and then fell still. The deafening cacophony of alarms ceased, replaced by the steady, blessed hum of a ship holding the line. We had done it. We had chained a dying star to our mast, and for now, against all odds, we were keeping it afloat. The blinding white energy that had thrown Aris against the wall receded, flowing back into the core not as a destructive wave but as a gentle, settling tide. The chamber was no longer a place of frantic energy and desperate gambits. It was a cathedral of silence, the air humming with a profound and ancient peace. The ChronoGuardian materialized once more, its form no longer a harsh lattice of judgment but a swirling, harmonious pattern of soft gold and serene blue. It regarded us, and for the first time its presence felt not like an interrogation but an acknowledgement. You did not seek to conquer, its voice echoed, a chorus now gentle and resonant. You did not seek to own, you sought to understand, and in understanding you sacrificed. Your actions have purged a corruption that festered for millennia. You have honored the true purpose of this place. The light of the core pulsed softly behind it, a heartbeat restored to a healthy, steady rhythm. The verdict is clear. You have proven worthy. The entity's form shifted, flowing into a new configuration that seemed to bow in a gesture of respect. The choice is now yours, as is the burden of its consequence. The archive is stable, its core realigned to its original, noble purpose. One path remains: the archive can be utterly destroyed, its knowledge erased from existence, ensuring its power can never again be misused. This is the path of finality, of absolute safety. The image of the archive dissolving into harmless light flickered in the air before us, a vision of a universe forever freed from this temptation. The other path, the Guardian continued, the light around it deepening, is guardianship. The archive will be sealed away from those who would plunder it, but it will not be lost. It will remain accessible, but only to those who approach with respect, who seek not to command time, but to learn from its flow. This is the path of eternal vigilance. This time, the vision was of the archive not as a vault, but as a beacon, its light a gentle guide to lost ships in the temporal sea, a sanctuary for true seekers of truth. All eyes turned to Aris. He slowly pushed himself up from the ground, his body weary but his spirit alight with the certainty of his new role. He looked at the core, then at the faces of his crew, the friends who had fought and bled and sacrificed to bring them to this moment. He thought of Lyra, her final act a testament to the value of this knowledge. Destroying it would make her sacrifice and Kale's courage meaningless. It would be an act of fear. He stepped forward, his voice clear and strong, carrying the weight of his vow not just to the Guardian, but to the memory of all that had been lost. "We will not choose the path of fear," he declared. "To destroy this knowledge is to forget the lessons it holds. It is to ensure that the arrogance of a Valerius could one day rise again, unchallenged by the memory of his failure." The archive is a warning and a wonder. It must be preserved. He placed a hand over his own heart, where the legacy of the first families now lived not as a curse but as a duty. We will be its protectors. We will stand as the gatekeepers, ensuring its power is a light for understanding, never again a weapon for control. The ChronoGuardian's light bloomed in acceptance, and a wave of energy passed through the cavern, through the ship, through us. It was not a shock, but a sealing, a binding. In that moment, our destinies were irrevocably altered. We were no longer just explorers of the Chronos. We were the sworn sentinels of the Forbidden Archive, our lives forever intertwined with the flow of time itself, our mission transformed from one of discovery to one of eternal, solemn guardianship. The deafening silence that followed the core's stabilization was a lie. It lasted only a second before it was shattered by a deep, groaning shudder that ran through the entire length of the Chronos. The archive, in its final act of healing, was rejecting us. A temporal backlash, the universe's immune response to a foreign body, was violently ejecting us from the wound we had just helped to suture. The main viewer, which had shown the serene, healed core, dissolved into a nightmare vortex of screaming light and shattered timelines. It wasn't a storm to be navigated, it was the plumbing of reality flushing itself clean. The ship was seized by forces that had nothing to do with physics, wrenched and spun like a leaf in a hurricane. Alarms we didn't even know we had begun to shriek, their warnings obsolete before the sound finished echoing. "Brace for impact, we're being purged," Kale roared from the helm, his hands a white-knuckled blur on the controls. He wasn't trying to steer anymore, that was impossible. He was fighting for stability, trying to keep the ship from spinning apart at the seams. The structural integrity field is overloading. I'm rerouting power from life support, from weapons, from everything. Hang on, this is going to be rough. The Chronos bucked violently, thrown sideways through a corridor that was no longer a corridor but a tunnel through the heart of a dying star. Then it was a glacier, then it was the vacuum before the Big Bang. We weren't just moving through space, we were being scraped along the jagged edge of causality itself. The shriek of tortured metal competed with the dissonant scream of physics being broken. Through the viewport, we saw glimpses of impossible geometries, cities built of light and sound, civilizations rising and falling in the space between heartbeats, the ghosts of futures that would never be. Kale's face was set in a grimace of pure concentration, sweat beading on his forehead despite the freezing cold that was now seeping onto the bridge. He was flying on instinct, making micro-adjustments that had less to do with navigation and more to do with survival, like a sailor feeling the shift of the wind a moment before the storm hits. Almost through, he shouted, though the words were torn away by the din. The rift is collapsing behind us, one more push, with a final, gut-wrenching lurch that threw us all against our restraints. The Chronos shot forward into a sudden, shocking blackness. The terrible noise ceased, replaced by a silence so absolute it felt like a physical pressure. The violent shaking stopped, the ship gliding forward on momentum alone. On the viewer, the chaotic maelstrom was gone. In its place was the quiet, familiar, and blessedly empty blackness of normal space, dotted with the faint, steady pinpricks of distant stars. For a long moment, no one spoke. The only sounds were the ragged breaths of the crew and the persistent, desperate beeping of the damaged control board. Then the emergency lighting flickered on, casting the bridge in a dim, crimson glow. The main consoles were dark, their systems offline. The hum of the engines was gone, replaced by an ominous silence. We were adrift. Kale slumped in his chair, exhaling a long, shaky breath. Main power is offline, engines are dead, life support is on batteries, and we've got maybe 12 hours. His report was clipped, professional, but the exhaustion in his voice was profound. We had won. We had saved all of history. And now we were a frozen, silent tomb floating in the deepest, darkest corner of uncharted space, with no way to call for help and no way to get home. The adventure was over, but a new, more terrifying mystery had just begun. Where were we, and with the archive now sealed and hidden, was there anyone left in the universe who would even think to look for us? The quiet on the bridge was a heavy, physical thing, broken only by the sporadic hiss of a severed conduit and the low, desperate beeping of the damaged control console. The adrenaline that had carried us through the heart of the storm was gone, leaving behind a hollow, aching exhaustion. I slowly released my death grip on the command chair, my joints protesting. We were alive, the ship was a wreck, but we were breathing. My eyes scanned the dim, crimson-lit bridge, taking stock of the faces that had shared this nightmare with me. Kale was already at his station, his movement slow and deliberate as he assessed the catastrophic system's damage. Aris stood near the main viewer, his gaze fixed on the unfamiliar starfield, his expression unreadable, the weight of the custodian's knowledge a new stillness upon him. Then my gaze fell on Lyra's empty station. The console was dark, a single, fine crack running across its surface. The silence from that corner of the bridge was louder than any alarm. She wasn't just absent, her presence, her brilliant, methodical mind that had so often been our compass, was a void. We had saved all of history, and in doing so, we had paid for it with a piece of our own. The cost of our victory was etched into that empty chair, a loss so profound it felt like a structural failure in the ship's very soul. Kale's voice cut through the silence, rough with fatigue and strain. Main engines are offline, comms are slack, life support is on battery reserves, and we've got maybe 12 hours before we're breathing vacuum. He ran a hand over his face, leaving a smudge of grime. The temporal recoil fried half our primary systems. It's a miracle we're in one piece. He didn't say her name, he didn't have to. The effort it had taken to keep the rest of us in one piece was written in the tense set of his shoulders and the blackened, raw skin on his hands. It was Aris who finally spoke, his voice a low, resonant thing that seemed to carry the echo of the archive itself. He turned from the viewport, and his eyes held a depth they hadn't possessed before, as if he were seeing not just the room, but the countless threads of cause and effect that had woven this moment. "It's more than that," he said, his tone not triumphant but awestruck and humbled. "We didn't just fix a machine or stop a villain. We reached into the core of causality and we mended it. We didn't just preserve history, we actively restored a future that was stolen. We have changed history itself." The sheer, terrifying scale of what we had done settled over the bridge. We were no longer just explorers who had witnessed great events. We were individuals who had become a pivotal event. A grim, determined smile touched Kale's lips as he finally looked up from his console, his practical engineer's mind already shifting from what was broken to what we now possessed. "Yeah, we changed it, and we've got the receipt." He gestured vaguely with a burned hand, a sweeping motion that encompassed the entire, forbidden knowledge we now carried. That vault, that entire archive, its secrets aren't just sitting in some distant nebula anymore. They're right here, in our logs, in our sensor data, in his head. He nodded toward Aris. "We're not just historians anymore. We're librarians for the most dangerous library in existence, and we've got a vault full of secrets to protect." The truth of his words landed with the force of a hull breach. The mission was far from over. It had simply changed its shape. We were no longer hunters seeking a myth. We were guardians standing watch over a truth too powerful to be known. Valerius was gone, but his ambition was a timeless poison. There would always be others, powerful factions, rogue civilizations, individuals drunk on the possibility of controlling time itself who would catch the scent of what we had found. They would hunt for the legend of the Forbidden Archive, and their search would inevitably lead them to us, to the crew of the ship that vanished into a temporal anomaly and returned different. Our vigilance could not end. It had to become our new purpose, a silent, endless war fought in the shadows of history to protect the very flow of time from those who would seek to divert it for their own ends. The quiet of the bridge was no longer just the aftermath of a battle. It was the first moment of a much longer, much quieter war. The silence that had settled over the bridge was fragile. A thin veneer of calm stretched over the raw, exposed nerves of our exhaustion. It was shattered not by an alarm, but by a low, dissonant hum that seemed to emanate from the ship's very frame. Lyra's sensor console, dark and silent since her sacrifice, flickered to life on its own, the screen filling with a scrolling cascade of data that made no sense. Kale was at his station in an instant, his burned hands flying across the interface with a hiss of pain. "It's not us," he growled, his voice tight. "It's an external scan. A powerful one. It's pinging us with a temporal frequency I've never seen before." On the main viewer, the serene starfield dissolved, replaced by a tactical overlay. One by one, crimson icons blinked into existence at the edge of the system, a silent, growing constellation of unknown ships. They weren't emerging from warp, they were simply there, materializing out of the void as if they'd been waiting, cloaked for this exact moment. Their design was like nothing in any database, angular and predatory, their hulls seeming to absorb the starlight around them, making them appear as jagged cuts in the fabric of space itself. Before I could even form a question, the comms panel lit up. There was no hailing frequency, no request for communication. A voice, synthesized and utterly devoid of emotion, filled the bridge. It was a sound that felt like ice water down the spine. "Chrono's vessel. We have monitored the temporal recalibration event. The energy signature of the Forbidden Archive is a beacon to us. You will surrender its core and its custodian. Compliance will be met with swift oblivion. Resistance will be met with a fate that will unravel the very concept of your existence." The message terminated, leaving behind a silence more terrifying than any threat. They hadn't discovered the archive. They had felt its rebirth, its return to stability from across the cosmos. They weren't pirates or scavengers. They were hunters who tracked their prey by the ripples it made in time. Kale's face was ashen. "They're locking targeting solutions. Their weapons, Captain. Their weapons aren't reading as energy-based. The scanners are classifying them as localized temporal distortion projectors. They don't mean to destroy the ship. They mean to age it into dust around us or regress it to its component atoms before it was ever built." The horrific implication hung in the air. This wasn't a battle we could fight with shields and plasma torpedoes. We were facing an enemy that could simply unmake us. All eyes turned to Aris. He stood perfectly still, his gaze fixed on the armada displayed on the screen, but he wasn't seeing the ships. His eyes held the distant focus of someone listening to a symphony only he could hear, the weight of the archive's knowledge flowing through him. "The Eternity Wardens," he said, the name emerging from his lips like a long-forgotten secret. "They are a covenant, a fanatical order that believes temporal power is a divine right, a force to be hoarded and wielded by a chosen few. They have sought the archive for millennia, not to learn from it, but to use it as a cudgel, to freeze the universe in a single, perpetual moment of their own choosing, erasing all dissent, all change, all free will." He finally turned to look at us, and in his eyes we saw not fear, but the terrible clarity of the custodian. They felt the surge of the core's realignment. They know we have achieved what they never could. We have mastered it without being corrupted by it, and that makes us the only thing in the universe they truly fear. The choice before him was monstrous. To fight was to risk the archive falling into the hands of the ultimate extremists, granting them the power to impose a terrible, static eternity on all of creation. Our ship was crippled. A direct confrontation wasn't a battle, it was a suicide run. But to run, to hide, that was its own form of betrayal. It meant condemning the archive to the very isolation and obscurity that had allowed Valerius's corruption to fester. It meant admitting that its knowledge was too dangerous to ever be used, rendering Lyra's sacrifice and our entire ordeal meaningless. Aris closed his eyes, his hand resting on the cold surface of Lyra's empty console, as if seeking guidance from the echo of her presence. He was not just a captain choosing a tactic, he was a custodian deciding the future of time itself. Aris's fingers moved over the comms panel with a deliberate slowness, the simple act of inputting a secure channel sequence feeling like an epochal decision. The connection was not instant. It hissed and crackled, scrambling through a dozen anonymous relays and quantum-entangled frequencies before a familiar, grim face resolved on the screen, the image slightly grainy with the immense distance it had traveled. Admiral Valen of the Temporal Integrity Commission looked older. The lines on his face, etched deeper by burdens Aris could now fully appreciate. There was no greeting. Valen's eyes, sharp and weary, took in the battered state of the Chronos' bridge, the exhaustion on our faces, and the profound change in Aris's own bearing. Custodian, Valen said, the title a solemn acknowledgement. The silence from your sector was concerning. Then we felt it, a shockwave of causal realignment, clean and pure, unlike anything ever recorded. You succeeded. It wasn't a question. Aris wasted no time laying out the stark reality: the crippled ship, the Eternity Warden's sudden appearance, the immense and terrible responsibility now chained to our hull. He spoke not as a junior officer reporting to a superior, but as one guardian to another, his voice steady with the unnerving calm the Corps had given him. Valen listened in absolute silence, his expression growing grimmer with each word. When Aris finished, the Admiral leaned forward, his face filling the screen. The background of his sterile command center a stark contrast to our damaged bridge. Then you already know you cannot do this alone, Valen stated, his voice low and urgent. The Wardens are a hydra, cut off one head, and two more will emerge from the shadows of time. Your victory has made you a target for every power, faction, and fanatic who has ever dreamed of controlling causality. The Chronos is a lifeboat, Aris. You are trying to guard the fate of all creation from a lifeboat. You must form a coalition. You must share the burden. The idea was anathema. After the betrayal of Valerius, the very notion of bringing others into this sanctum felt like a profound violation. But Valen was relentless, his logic as cold and hard as space itself. The Archive's power is a universal constant. Its protection must be a universal undertaking. No single species, no one government can be trusted with this. The only way to ensure its safety is to create a balance of power, a council of guardians where no single voice can dominate. The risk of collaboration is great, but the certainty of failure alone is absolute. He transmitted a short list, a handful of galactic powers known for their stability, their long-term perspectives, and their fierce independence. The celestial concord of Lyra, ancient and serene, the mechanized synod of Kalan, logical and precise, the free colonies of the Rim, unpredictable and fiercely protective of their autonomy. A disparate, potentially volatile alliance united by nothing but the Admiral's word and our desperate need. The negotiations that followed were a different kind of battle, fought with words and implications across a multi-channel link. Each envoy was shown only a fragment of the truth, enough to understand the threat's magnitude, but not enough to pinpoint the Archive's nature or location. The Lyran diplomat spoke in poetic terms of safeguarding the great song of time. The Kalan representative analyzed the tactical data on the Wardens with chilling, machinic efficiency, stating their defense would require a 34% increase in synchronized patrols. The Rim colonials were blunt, their grizzled ambassador demanding to know what we were really protecting and what. In it for them, the air on the bridge grew thick with tension and mistrust. It was Kale, of all people, who intervened at a critical impasse, his engineer's pragmatism cutting through the diplomatic fog. "You're all thinking about how to use this thing," he barked over the channel, his burned hand gesturing at the view screen. "Start thinking about how to keep it from being used. This isn't a weapon to be aimed, it's a fault line. Our only job is to make sure nobody ever gets to jump on it." One by one, reluctantly, agreements were forged. Mutual defense pacts, shared intelligence networks, non-aggression treaties centered solely on the protection of the asset. It was a fragile, nascent alliance, a web of promises spun over a bottomless chasm. As the final signature was electronically ratified, Valen requested a final, private channel with Aris. The Admiral's face was grave. "You have your coalition, custodian. A necessary shield, but never forget what you hold." He leaned closer, his voice dropping to a near whisper, each word a shard of ice. "You have just handed a key to the fundamental engine of reality, to beings whose deepest desires you cannot possibly know. You are surrounded by allies who now know such a power exists and that you are its gatekeeper. Trust their protocols, trust their pledged ships, but trust no one's ambition. No one's heart. The Wardens will come with warships. Your new allies may yet covet what you protect, and they will come with smiles and offers of help. The politics have only just begun, and every hand that reaches out to you from this day forward must be watched, for even the gentlest touch may be seeking to take what is yours to guard." The channel closed, leaving us not with the comfort of allies, but with the chilling certainty that we had just multiplied the number of potential enemies we had to face. The bridge was a tomb of grim resolve, the weight of Admiral Valen's warning a heavier burden than the enemy fleet on our screens. Kale was routing every trickle of auxiliary power to the failing shields, his movements sharp with the frustration of a master engineer reduced to polishing a sinking ship. Aris stood rigid before the main viewer, his gaze fixed on the predatory forms of the Warden's fleet, his mind no doubt sifting through the infinite knowledge of the core for a solution that wouldn't risk the very reality we were trying to protect. We were out of gambits, out of time, and preparing for a final, futile stand. And then, a single light on Lyra's dark console flickered. It was a soft, gentle pulse of blue, a color so different from the harsh crimson of the alerts that we all noticed it at once. A low, melodic chime, the one she had programmed for a passive, non-threatening data stream, echoed softly in the tense silence. Kale froze, his hands hovering over his controls. Aris turned, his custodian's composure cracking for the first time, his eyes wide with a desperate, impossible hope. The console screen remained dark, but the air above it shimmered, the way it had when the crystalline shard first projected its map. But this was different. The light was faint, unstable, like a ghost trying to remember its shape. It resolved not into a star chart, but into a faint, shimmering outline, a human form, translucent and ethereal. It was Lyra, or an echo of her. Her image flickered, a signal struggling to hold its coherence against a storm of interference. Her voice, when it came, was not a sound heard by the ears, but a thought placed directly into our minds, thin and distant, as if shouted across a vast and windy plain. "I am here," the thought voice whispered, a thread of consciousness woven from the archive's own energy. "I am not gone." When I interfaced with the core, my consciousness didn't dissipate. It was integrated. The archive recognized a pattern of pure intent, a mind that sought not to command but to mend. It preserved me within its foundational matrix. I am part of its memory now, a living echo in the machine. A wave of profound, aching relief washed over the bridge, so powerful it was immediately followed by a stab of grief. She was there, but she was not here. Her next thought confirmed it, carrying a sorrow that was entirely and heartbreakingly her own. I can see through its eyes. I can feel the flow of its knowledge, but I am anchored here. I cannot return to the shape I was. My sacrifice was not a moment, it is my new state of being. Before the sorrow could truly take root, her image flickered with new urgency, resolving into a complex, shimmering tactical overlay that superimposed itself over the Warden fleet on the main viewer. There is no time for grief. They are not just scanning for the archive's energy signature, Captain. They are listening for its rhythm. Their targeting systems are synchronized to the core's pulse frequency. They plan to fire a resonant dissonance charge, a weapon that will not destroy the archive but will shatter its newly restored harmony. throwing it back into chaos and making it vulnerable to their takeover. The overlay zoomed in on the lead ship, highlighting a unique, bulbous projection on its hull. That is their conductor. It broadcasts the cancelling frequency. But their weapon is also their weakness. The frequency must be perfect or it is useless. Her voice in our minds grew stronger, more focused, the scientist reasserting herself over the echo. The archive's core is now stable, its frequency a constant, but I can create a phantom echo, a false pulse that mimics the core's signature from a century in the past, a frequency that differs by 0.003%. It is a minute variance, but it will be enough. If you can target their conductor and force them to lock onto my false echo, their own weapon will feed back on itself. It will not destroy them, but it will render their entire fleet deaf and blind to the true core for crucial minutes. It was more than a tactic, it was a masterpiece of temporal misdirection. But her final revelation was the true key. Her image dissolved again, reforming into a schematic of the archive itself, but from an angle we had never seen, a cross-section that delved into layers of reality beneath the physical structure. This is what Valerius truly sought, and what the Wardens would kill to possess. The archive is not just a repository, it is a seed. The core's energy, in its purest, most stable form, does not just preserve time. It has the potential to gently nudge it toward kinder possibilities, to reinforce timelines where cooperation outweighs conflict, where understanding defeats fear. This was the Builder's final, secret hope, not for control but for gentle guidance. This is the ultimate secret of the Vault. This is why it must never fall into their hands. They wouldn't just own the past, they would dictate the very nature of a future built on their own ruthless ideology. The path was clear. We had a weapon, we had a target, and we had the most powerful motivation imaginable. We were no longer fighting for our lives, we were fighting for the soul of every tomorrow. The lead enemy ship, a jagged dagger of blackened alloy, opened fire. But its energy beam didn't lance toward us. Instead, it struck empty space 100 kilometers to our starboard, and the void there curdled. Space-time itself wrinkled and tore, opening a temporary rift that disgorged 3 more Warden fighters directly into our flank. Their attack was not a test of our shields, it was a statement. They were not bound by the normal rules of engagement. They could rewrite the battlefield itself. Evasive pattern Delta 7, I shouted, but Aris's voice cut through the chaos, calm and absolute. Belay that captain, hold position. We all turned to him. He stood at the center of the bridge, his eyes closed, one hand pressed against a bare crystalline conduit. The archive's knowledge wasn't on a screen for him, it was a river flowing directly into his mind. Their tactical algorithm is a variant of the Cretan War doctrine, he stated, his voice devoid of emotion, a pure conduit for data. They will attempt a pincer maneuver. The ship to our port, designation Scimitar, will feint high. The real threat is coming from the rift below. A frigate is preparing to translate in 5-4 On the main viewer, the Scimitar lunged upward exactly as he'd said. A second later, space rippled beneath us, and the menacing bow of a Warden frigate began to emerge from nothingness. 2-1. Now Kale full power to ventral thrusters, hard to starboard. Present our starboard battery and fire the moment she solidifies. The Chronos groaned, heaving violently to the side. The Warden frigate completed its translation, its weapons powering up, only to find its primary target had already moved and its broadside was perfectly exposed to our full volley. Plasma torpedoes and focused beam fire smashed into its unshielded flank. The frigate shuddered, its systems overloading in a chain reaction of internal explosions before it could even fire a single shot. A cheer started on the bridge but died in our throats as Aris spoke again, his voice tighter now. They're adapting, shifting to temporal echo tactics. They're going to target our past position. The enemy fighters began to flicker, their images becoming hazy and indistinct. They weren't moving through space, they were subtly phasing through microseconds of time, making targeting computers useless. Their weapons fired, and the blast seemed to originate from where we had been a moment ago, slamming into our dorsal shields with terrifying accuracy. "I can't get a lock," our weapons officer yelled in frustration. "They're everywhere and nowhere." Aris's brow was furrowed in intense concentration, a single trickle of blood tracing a path from his nose. The strain of processing so much information was physically taxing him. "Their pattern is predictable once you see the harmonics," he murmured, more to himself than to us. "Lyra, feed a counter frequency into the targeting sensors, modulating at 12.2 terahertz. It will sync our perception with their phase variants." There was a beat of painful silence. Kale, his hands flying over the engineering console, grunted, "I've got it, rerouting sensor control." A moment later, the flickering enemy ships on our screen snapped into sharp, solid focus. They were no longer ghosts. "All batteries fire at will," I commanded. Our weapons found their marks, and two of the phased fighters vanished into brilliant fireballs. The Warden Command ship, seeing its advanced tactics neutralized, changed its approach. A new, chillingly calm voice came over the open comms. "Custodian. You fight well for a relic, but you protect a power you are too small to comprehend. Stand aside. The future belongs to those who are willing to seize time itself." Aris finally opened his eyes. They were no longer the eyes of our historian. They held the cold fire of a billion witnessed histories. He moved to the comms panel himself and opened a channel to the entire Warden Armada. His voice, when he spoke, was not loud, but it carried an impossible weight, a gravity that seemed to still the very battle around us. "You mistake preservation for weakness," he said, each word clear and precise. "You see a tool and think only of how it can break. We see a legacy and understand the cost of its keeping. The Forbidden Archive is not a weapon to be seized. It is a responsibility to be borne. It is the memory of every civilization that reached too high and fell, of every soul that believed they could master the river of time only to be drowned by its current." He paused, and his gaze swept across our bridge, meeting each of our eyes, drawing strength from our resolve. "You offer a future built on control. We defend a future built on free will. And we will defend it to our last breath." The silence on the channel was absolute. His words hung in the void, a declaration more powerful than any torpedo. Then a new voice, young and fierce, crackled over our internal comms. It was Ensign Rhea from Damage Control. "Then let's make sure we have plenty of breath left, Custodian. Shields are recharged, weapons are hot." His speech had not been for the enemy, it had been for us. A surge of renewed determination electrified the crew. This was no longer a battle against an overwhelming foe. It was a stand for the very soul of history. We fought with a ferocity born of that certainty, each of us a guardian of the light Aris had sworn to protect. The Wardens had come for a weapon. They found instead a creed and a crew ready to die for it. The silence that settled over the bridge after the last Warden ship vanished into a temporal tear was heavier than the void outside. It was the quiet of a battlefield after the storm, filled not with peace, but with the groaning of a mortally wounded ship and the ragged breaths of its surviving crew. For a long moment, no one moved, the adrenaline crash leaving us hollow and staring at the static-filled screens. Then Kale let out a long, shaky sigh, the sound loud in the stillness. "We're dead in the water," he stated, his voice raspy with exhaustion. "Engines are offline, primary life support is on battery reserves, and the hull is Swiss cheese. We're not going anywhere under our own power." The immediate victory was real, but the cost was a cage of drifting metal. The grim reality of our situation was a cold splash of water. We were victorious guardians of a cosmic secret, adrift in an uncharted sector with a broken ship and a target on our backs larger than any star system. Hiding the Chronos was our only option, but finding a place to hide something of her size and energy signature seemed impossible. It was Aris, his hand still resting on the crystalline conduit, who provided the answer. His eyes were closed, seeing a map we could not. "There's a nebula less than 0.2 light years from the archive's true location," he murmured, his voice distant. "Its ionic interference is a perfect natural cloak, and within it a planetoid. It's not on any chart. The builders knew of it. They called it the Anchor. Its crust is rich with crystalline deposits that resonate with the archive's core frequency. We can land there. The planet itself will mask our presence, and the crystals can be used to help repair the ship's damaged systems." It wasn't just a hiding spot, it was a sanctuary designed for this exact purpose, a secret kept for millennia, waiting for its first and last inhabitants. The journey, there was a tense, silent crawl on emergency thrusters, every creak of the hull a potential death knell. But as we passed into the nebula's swirling, violet embrace, the constant, gnawing anxiety of being watched began to fade. The Anchor was a stark, beautiful world of jagged purple crystal formations and deep, shadowed canyons. Setting the broken Chronos down in the largest canyon felt less like a crash landing and more like a ship finally coming to rest in a dry dock built by gods. The work that followed was arduous, a symphony of plasma torches, replaced conduits, and grueling exterior repairs in Envira suits. Kale became a whirlwind of focused energy, his genius repurposed from temporal mechanics to sheer, stubborn survival. We weren't just fixing a ship, we were building a home, a fortress, and a monument to our new duty. When the worst of the damage was stabilized and a basic operational base was established within the ship and the canyon around it, Aris called us all to the main hangar bay. He stood before the massive, scarred hull of the Chronos, the nebula's light casting long shadows through the open bay doors. In his hands, he held the data slate containing Lyra's final, heroic act and the corrupted schematics of Valerius. He didn't speak of victory or of loss, he spoke of legacy. "We did not choose this duty," he began, his voice quiet but carrying to every corner of the vast space. "It was thrust upon us by the arrogance of one man and the courage of another. We have held the heart of time in our hands, and we have felt its terrible weight and its incredible beauty. To walk away is impossible. To keep it for ourselves is the path to the very corruption we fought." He looked at each of us, Kale with his burned hands, the bridge crew with their tired eyes, all of us forever changed. The ChronoGuardian was a program, a set of rules. What this power needs is not a warden of code, but guardians of conscience. This is not about ownership. It is about stewardship. It is a vow to stand watch so that no one else must pay the price we have paid. He placed the data slate on the deck plating between us, a silent altar to our shared ordeal. Then he did not ask for our loyalty or our obedience. He asked for our oath. "If you are with me in this, then stand with me now." Not as crewmates following orders, but as partners swearing a covenant. "We will protect the timeline from those who would break it. We will learn from the past without seeking to alter it. We will safeguard the future without seeking to control it." We are the ChronoGuardians now, the protectors of time itself. One by one, we stepped forward, placing our hands over the slate, our voices joining his in a simple, solemn promise that echoed in the hangar bay. There were no grand ceremonies, no medals. There was only the weight of the vow and the silent understanding in our eyes. In the days that followed, that oath became our new mission protocol. Using the archive's knowledge and the Chronos' repaired sensors, we established a permanent monitoring station, a web of subtle probes disguised as asteroids, designed to listen for the specific entropy signature of temporal manipulation. We weren't looking for natural rifts or anomalies. We were hunting for the artificial, for the arrogant hand trying to bend time to its will. Kale dubbed it the weirdness detector, but the name belied its profound purpose. Its first alert was not a world-ending catastrophe. but a small, precise fluctuation in a nearby system, a minor noble on a backwater world using a salvage device to retroactively win a petty land dispute. The intervention was swift, silent, and involved little more than a malfunctioning generator and a strongly worded, anonymous data packet detailing the long-term consequences of his actions. It was a small thing, but it was a start. We had become the subtle shepherds of causality, ensuring the river of time flowed clean, one corrected ripple at a time. The final repairs to the Chronos were complete, her hull scarred but sealed, a silent monument to the tempest we had weathered. We gathered on the bridge one last time, not as a crew preparing for a journey, but as sentinels standing their first watch. The main viewer showed the serene, swirling violet of the nebula that was now our home, our cloak, our anchor. Beyond its protective embrace, the stars shone with a familiar, distant light, but they felt different now. Each pinprick of light was no longer just a destination. It was a moment in a vast, interconnected story we were now sworn to protect. Aris stood before the screen, his posture no longer that of a scholar but of a custodian, the quiet weight of the archive's infinite knowledge a permanent stillness in his gaze. He keyed a final, encrypted sequence into the comms panel, a message not for the Temporal Integrity Commission or our new, fragile coalition, but for any future soul who might one day stumble upon our frequency and wonder what had become of the lost crew of the Chronos. His voice, when he spoke, was calm and resonant, carrying the gravity of hard-won truth. "The ChronoVault is secured," he began, the words simple, final. "Its power is contained, its corruption cleansed, but its presence is now a part of us, a weight we will carry forever. We have learned that some archives must remain forbidden, their doors sealed not out of fear, but out of reverence for the delicate balance they represent." He paused, looking out at the boundless sea of stars, each one a potential tragedy or triumph waiting to unfold. Yet their lessons must never be forgotten. They must guide us, remind us of the precipice we walk, for time itself is not a tool to be mastered or a weapon to be wielded. It is our greatest ally, the very fabric of our existence, and it is our most perilous foe, forever waiting for the slightest arrogance to unravel everything we hold dear. The transmission ended, the quiet hum of the ship settling around us once more. There was no grand fanfare, no promise of a next great adventure. There was only the solemn, enduring understanding of our new purpose. We were not heroes returning to a parade. We were guardians fading into the shadows, our victory measured not in conquests but in the silent, uninterrupted flow of history. The adventure was over, the real work had just begun, and as we looked out at the infinite tapestry of the cosmos, we knew that our watch, for as long as we drew breath, would never truly